Howdy, everybody. I'm looking forward to today's chapter. Before we get into that one, let us go backwards in times and do a little review. So last chapter, we read that red rain. So Zeus had sent in rain, or this huge storm, and it was raining red, so like blood red. Now the Trojans, they got really pushed back, but then they got this like spirit in them, and they started really going at the Greeks. And they did so well that they got, if you look at this, they got Agamemnon, Diomedes, Odysseus, and even Machaon, who's their doctor. They damaged all of them, so they had to go out of the battle. So the Trojans are really doing well right now. Agamemnon was really concerned, so Patroclus happened to come out because Achilles said, "Hey, go check out what's going on." Patroclus was out there, and Agamemnon's like, "We really need help. How about you, Patroclus, Achilles' best friend, put on Achilles' war gear and his helmet and all that and pretend to be Achilles." So the Trojans were like, "Oh my God, Achilles is back. What are we going to do?" That type of thing. So Patroclus is kind of on his way back, so we'll see what happens maybe in this chapter coming up. And this chapter is called Battle for the Ship. So let me show you that image again. Well, let's hop in. Meanwhile, Hector was urging on the front fighters of his war host to cross the ditch, which the Greeks had made. But the chariot horses checked on the brink of it, whinnying in fear, like, "Ooh!" For it was deep and broad and set with sharpened stakes. So you know horses don't want to run into these wooden stakes that could jab into them. And between ditch and wall, where the back-driven Greeks were massing or getting pushed back, there would be no space to dismount and fight. Finally, the warriors left the charioteers to wait on the far side of the ditch and, forming themselves into 5 companies or groups, made the crossing on foot, each behind their leaders. Behind Hector and Paris, Helenus and Aeneas, with the allies behind Sarpedon in close formation, joining their oxhide shields into a solid wall as they made their furious charge. They've all got their shields up and they're pushing forward. The gateway through which the Greek chariots came and went was still open, an escape way for fleeing warriors, men standing massed and ready on either side. Great Asios, most headstrong of all the Trojans, set his huge chestnut horses straight at it, so kind of like all of his brown horses, thinking to crash through. But 2 champions, both Lapith spearmen from the far north, had taken their stand in the opening and, covered by their comrades, throwing rocks and spears from the ramparts on either side, held the attack at bay while the leaves of the great gate were urged to made fast. And I think you can see some of that in the image I'll put up there. All right, next chapter. Next page. What am I saying? Further along the wall, before another gate, Hector's company or group, who should have been foremost in the attack, were hesitating. So they should have been up front, but they're like, "I don't know." An eagle, the bird of Zeus, flying over, had dropped a live snake, red as blood, into their midst. This they took for an evil omen, so something like a warning to them. Some even thought that they should call off the attack for that day. But Hector told them, "One omen is best of all, to fight for your country." This put new heart or motivation into them, so that they raised the war shout and thrust forward again where he had led. So he's like, "Fight for your country," which in this case is Troy. Let's get going. Further still along the battle line, Sarpedon, with Glaucus, his friend and sword brother, were hurling themselves at the wall like mountain lions, the allies storming at their heels. So these guys are just fighting as hard as they can. They made a breach into the stockade, so they busted through a little bit, but for a while could not break through the defenders who swarmed against them from the inside. So they broke in, but then these people keep coming from the inside and battling them back. Glaucus took an arrow in the arm and had to retreat to get the barb cut out. Blood spattered on the gate timbers, and the roar and weapon clash of battle rolled from end to end of the wall. So this is a bloody mess here. Hector's company or group were tearing at the gate timber, striving to tear down the wall parapet. So they wanted to break down this whole wall that the Greeks had made. But the Greeks within made another parapet on their own shields and flung down rocks and spears upon them. Then Hector seized a great stone. 2 men could not have lifted it, but Zeus made it seem to him no heavier than a baled ram's fleece. And he took his stand with legs spread to grip the ground beneath him, and hurled the rock with all of his force at the gate before him. The bars burst wide and the timber shattered, and, shouting to his men to follow, he sprang through, with a roar like a torrent breaking free as men came pouring through the gate and over the palisades on either side. The Greeks were caught up in the flood of their coming and hurled back among their ships. So they really broke through at this point. So the Trojans are basically on top of the Greeks right at the ships. Then Zeus, I'm going to put up this picture too to go along. Then Zeus, having brought the Trojans into the heart of the Greek camp, left the desperate battle swirling under the very sterns of the black galleys and turned his thoughts elsewhere. But blue-haired Poseidon, who's now up on the screen here, Lord of the oceans and the earthquake, was looking that way and saw the desperate state of the Greeks. And he harnessed his wind-swift horses to his chariot and came driving up from his palace beneath the waves. Huge sea monsters sporting about him like dolphins around the bows of his ship, until he brought his team plunging ashore below the Greek camp like white rollers breaking on a beach. So it looks like Poseidon, that great god, came down himself into this area to join the battle. There he left them and went up unseen among the hard-pressed warriors, putting fresh heart into them and urging them to stand firm. And so, not knowing who was amongst them, they stood and strengthened as the power of the god flowed into them. They flung back the Trojans and closed ranks about their ships. So it sounds like you can't actually see Poseidon, but you're getting this sense that, wow, there's a god fighting with me. So the Greeks got pumped up. And in the midst of the reeling mass, the craziness, Hector and Ajax came together. Ajax caught up one of the great stones that were used as chocks under the keels of the ships and heaved it high. Then he dashed it down upon Hector. Boom! Catching him over the shield arm and below the helmet strap so that he dropped like a bull under the axe of a sacrifice, with all his armor clanging about him. Instantly his companions sprang close about him, and, while some guarded their rear and flanks, others bore him off out of the fighting. So they grabbed Hector like, let's get him out of here to be safe. And seeing great Hector carried off seemingly dead, the Greeks, with Poseidon still unknown in their midst behind them, set up a roar of triumph louder than a storm at sea and surged forward, hurling the Trojans back to the walls and over them and across the ditch onto the open plain. So Hector seems to be dead. We've got this god. I don't know what we've got with us. We're going to keep going. And they just get pumped. It was then that Zeus looked again toward Troy. He saw the Trojans in flight, and he saw Hector vomiting black blood as he lay beside the ford of the river Xanthus, where his companions had set him down. And he knew that these things were his brother Poseidon's doing. There was little enough he could do about Poseidon, who was almost his equal in power. But he called for Apollo, the sun lord, the far shooter, sender of fear upon men, and bade him or called him down, go down to where great Hector lay and breathe fresh life into him, and battle power such as he had never known before. So it looks like Hector might have actually died or been seriously injured. But Zeus is like, hey, Apollo, get down here and breathe some life and just energy and power into Hector right now. Apollo went swooping down with the speed of a hawk of the eye of the sun. He came to where Hector lay with his companion dashing cold water over him and breathed fresh life and the strength of his own godhood into him. And Hector rose and called for his armor and turned back to the battle. Let me show this image too. The Greeks saw him coming, like a storm cloud coming up against the wind, and fear of him such as they had never known before came upon them. Now you can imagine, you thought this guy is dead. You see him like almost like he's just so beat. And then all of a sudden he comes back and he's stronger than before. You might be like, oh man, what is going on here? I'm scared. Nevertheless, though, Ajax and the other front fighters, the Greeks, formed themselves into a great shield of men to hold him while their comrades... Woo! Excuse me. I didn't cover my nose because I'm in my own house, so what can happen here, you know? But anyway, sorry about that. But Hector, with the Trojan chariots thundering back behind him, crashed through their scarce-formed ranks like a flung spear piercing through a hunting buckler. The battlefront broke and scattered, and men were killing men on the open plain, in the ditch, in the broken gateways. So just Trojans and Greeks are fighting everywhere, in ditches, on flat lands, everywhere. The Trojans had begun to strip the armor from the slain, but Hector shouted to them, "Go straight for the ships and leave the spoils of war. Any man I find lagging behind, I shall see him killed and his body flung to the dogs." So Hector is like, don't take all these valuables. Let's keep at them. Let's fight them until we beat them completely. And he swung his whip full from the shoulder and lashed his horses on, the chariots behind him raising a noise like Zeus's thunder that shakes the mountains. The warriors hurling their spears like lightning shafts as they came. So these guys are just charging forward, spears coming, chariots, horses. They flung the chariots forward into the ditch, the horses not swerving aside this time, even from the sharpened stakes, but pouring over as a great sea wave sweeps over the side of a sinking vessel. And over the bodies that already clogged the far side, they swarmed up and over the turf walls and the stockade, sweeping back the Greeks who sought to stand against them. Then they were among the ships. They've made it all the way to the Greek ships, wielding sword and axe, while the Greeks, crowding their galley decks, sought to drive them back with the long pikes used in sea fighting. So they're basically fighting on the ships at this point. And all the while, in the foremost and fiercest of the struggle, there was Hector, with the power of the gods still within him. The battle frenzy shone red behind his eyes, foam like a ram's fleece gathering out of the corners of his mouth, the hero light blazing like a torch above his head. And always he shouted as he went, his voice reaching from end to end of the battle, "Fire! Bring fire to the black ships!" So he's like, rah! He's going nuts. And I'll show you this image here. This is, you can see the real fighting. So you can see all the Trojans on the ground trying to get up to those ships and fight them. And then the Greeks have these long spears that they're trying to stop them from getting onto the ships. Men tore brands from the trampled cooking fires and rushed to follow him, whirling the smoking mare's tail of flame above their heads. The dead fell thick, and the living, led by Hector, plunged up over the clotted mounds of bodies to come aboard the ships. So you can imagine them stepping on top of bodies to get up there. Where on the decks of the ships, the desperate Greeks still stood to hurl them back. Still, the Trojan tide roared on past the foremost galleys, while Ajax, shouting to his comrades, "Come on! Come against Hector! This is no dance he makes between our ships!" leapt from deck to deck like a man who drives 4 horses abreast and leaps from the back of one to the back of another, thrusting all the while with a sea pike as long as 3 tall men. It looks like you can see Ajax there. He's jumping from ship to ship with this long pike. Smoke began to rise, and there was a crackle of flames from old salty ship's timbers. And all the while above the tumult rose Hector's trumpet shout, "Fire! Fire the black ships!" It was then that Patroclus, coming out from the hut of Eurypylus in the furthest part of the camp and upwind of the fighting, saw, as it seemed, had half the fleet in flames, so half of the Greek ships in flames, and the battle whirlpooling around the ships. So that is it for that chapter. You can see Patroclus, he's got his eyes, he's looking at this like, oh my God, half of the Greek ships are on fire. We're gonna all die. We're gonna lose this battle. So maybe he brings that word back to Achilles. The next chapter is called Armor of Achilles. Now, before getting to that chapter, because that's going to be next time, I just want to ask you a few questions. Actually, I'm going to ask you one question this time and one face. All right. And then next week we're going to be Monday. So we've got Thursday. I'll get to the next chapter. So the question for this one, I'm curious, with both the Greeks and the Trojans, you've seen these gods get involved in a different battling here. Do you think the Greeks and the Trojans thought they were completely responsible for who wins? Or do they leave it up or think, it's really up to the gods' hands? So what do you think's going on in their own minds at this point? Like, do I control the battle? Or is it the gods who control it? Or is it a combination? Like, what's going on? And then the face. Now, you guys have probably been pumped up in life before. Maybe you're playing soccer, you're playing some sport, or maybe you're just really into some activity, but you're like, yeah, I can do this. I want you to do the face of Hector when he has the power of Apollo in him. I don't think he even knows he has it in him, but it's just like, it just comes over him. I can beat anybody, all right? So this, I'm going to give you that face for me. That's it. I almost scared myself because I saw myself in the video here. So go ahead and give your face, and I will see you next time for the armor of Achilles. Adios for now, guys.